The uncomfortable silence in the room was broken by the sound of rain outside, but inside that mansion, the atmosphere was electric. Claire couldn't believe what she had just heard. Her face was flushed, and her voice, usually steady, now trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This doesn't make any sense. My father, he must have been manipulated. Elliot? He barely even spoke to you." Claire snapped, disregarding the lawyer's presence entirely. Across the room, Martin crossed his arms and rose slowly, his face etched with frustration. He began pacing back and forth, his breathing heavy as he tried to piece his thoughts together. "There's no way Walter did this. Something's off, this doesn't sound like him," he muttered under his breath, almost as if speaking to himself. Elliot, seated in a chair in the corner, looked like a ghost. The words still echoed in his mind. He, a janitor, had just been named the main heir to the fortune of a man who barely exchanged more than a couple of sentences with him each day. He didn't know what to do with his hands, what to say, or how to react. All he wanted was to disappear, but his legs refused to move. I don't know what to say. I didn't do anything, none of this makes sense to me either," he finally murmured, almost as if apologizing. "Of course, it doesn't make sense." Claire shot back, her anger directed at him like a sharp arrow. "Why would my father give this to you? Because you mopped the floors? Because you tended the garden? Do you think this is fair?" The lawyer stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "I ask that everyone maintain their composure. I understand this is unexpected, but Walter's decision was documented. He was of sound mind when he drafted this will." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "Sound mind? My father was a rational man, yes, but he would never do something so absurd. Martin, are you seriously not going to say anything?" Martin finally stopped pacing and looked at Claire, but he seemed defeated. "And what do you want me to say, Claire? What am I supposed to do? Go against what's in the will? That'll only make things worse." Martin's words hung heavily in the air, hitting Claire like a ton of bricks. Meanwhile, Elliot felt an even heavier weight settle on his shoulders. He had always been content to live a simple life, never asking for more than he had, never wanting to be the center of attention. But now, all eyes were on him, and he had no idea what to do with that. The truth was, even in silence, Elliot began to remember the years he had spent working for Walter. He couldn't understand the reasoning behind this decision, but deep down, a small voice whispered that this choice wasn't as random as it seemed. Something in Walter's behavior had always hinted at more than what met the eye. But at that moment, no one wanted speculation. Everyone wanted an explanation, and Walter Alden, the only one who could provide it, was no longer there to speak. The day Walter Alden passed away had seemed ordinary at first glance. The sky was clear, the morning air carried the fresh scent of cut grass, and the mansion's routine was peaceful. But when Elliot walked through the back door and saw Claire and Martin sitting in the living room, he sensed something was different. This wasn't a regular meeting, something was about to change forever. The stage was set. Walter's mansion, a place that had always been a backdrop for cold, silent moments, was now the epicenter of family drama. Claire, ever poised, held a teacup she barely sipped from. Martin, sitting beside her, kept his arms crossed, his expression heavy with tension. Elliot, always discreet, stayed in the background, as if his mere presence might disrupt the fragile balance of the room. The lawyer entered with a worn leather briefcase, seemingly oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. But as soon as he opened the sealed envelope, everyone in the room held their breath. Claire straightened her posture, her face betraying an almost arrogant anticipation. Martin, on the other hand, stared at the floor, as if already calculating his next move. Elliot tried to remain invisible, but he knew that whatever was about to be said would change his life forever. Walter Alden's will was last revised 2 months ago and is fully valid, the lawyer began, his voice steady and unhurried. Claire and Martin exchanged glances. 2 months. That meant Walter had altered the document shortly before his death. It was already a sign that something was amiss. "I'll get straight to the point," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. "Walter Alden leaves the majority of his fortune, including this property, to Elliot Spencer." The silence that followed was crushing. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Claire dropped her teacup, the hot liquid spreading across the Persian rug, unnoticed. Martin, who had appeared composed until then, slammed his palm against the coffee table. "Is this a joke?" he roared, leaping to his feet. Walter did this? To his own family? Elliot remained frozen. He didn't know what to do, what to say, or even where to look. His throat was dry, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't a man of many words, and at that moment, he knew anything he said would only make things worse. Claire finally found her voice. "My father wouldn't do this." He must have been confused, pressured. "This makes no sense," he barely spoke to Elliot. "There's no logic here." The lawyer held his ground. "Everything is documented." Walter knew exactly what he was doing. He specified every detail. The disbelief on Claire's face turned to anger. "Elliot, what did you do? Were you taking advantage of him? Is that it?" Elliot tried to respond, but his voice came out weak. I never asked for anything." Martin scoffed. "Of course, you didn't ask. He handed everything to you on a silver platter, didn't he?" God! Walter must have lost his mind. The room was on the verge of exploding. Every word felt like a spark, ready to ignite what remained of civility. But amidst the emotional storm, Elliot began to wonder, why would Walter entrust something so significant to him? He wasn't close to the family, nor was he someone who held any prominent role in the millionaire's life. And yet, there was something there. Something only Walter knew. When the emotional chaos finally subsided, the mansion's grand room seemed to settle into a heavy silence, though no one truly found peace. Claire and Martin continued to stare at Elliot, as if waiting for some kind of confession, but what could Elliot say? He didn't have the answers himself. That night, as the storm outside intensified, each of them was left to reflect on who Walter Alden truly was, and what might have driven such a reserved man to make such a radical decision. Walter had always been a man of few words but impactful actions. He wasn't the type to sit down and resolve family disputes with long conversations. In fact, he avoided confrontations altogether. Claire remembered the last argument she had with him, about 2 years prior. She wanted to sell a family property, something she deemed a poor investment. Walter refused, saying only, "That land has value, even if you don't see it." His tone was nearly cold, not from a lack of love, but because that was simply how Walter dealt with everything. For Martin, memories of Walter were a blend of admiration and resentment. He could never step out from his brother's shadow. Where Walter was strategic and tireless, Martin always seemed to lag behind, unable to keep up. Despite this, Walter often helped him financially but never spared him from criticism. Martin recalled a phrase Walter used repeatedly: "Work is the only way to create value." To Martin, it felt like a constant reminder of his own shortcomings. Meanwhile, Elliot sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the empty table as rain tapped against the window. He couldn't stop the flood of memories that began surfacing. Walter, though distant, had a peculiar way of noticing things. There was the time Elliot came to work sick because he needed the money to cover a hospital bill for his wife. Walter said nothing at the time, but at the end of the month, Elliot found an envelope with extra cash in his pay. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a quiet gesture that made Elliot realize Walter saw more than he let on. What no one knew, not even Claire, was that Walter carried his own regrets. Hidden away in the drawers of his study, among old contracts and papers, were letters he had written but never sent. They were words he had never managed to say aloud, words that might have explained everything, or at least part of the decision that had shaken his family to its core. Walter knew his relationship with Claire was fragile. He loved his daughter, but he never found a way to show it. Every decision he made seemed to widen the gap between them, like a bridge he could never finish building. He saw something in Claire that she didn't recognize in herself, a strength that didn't need to be fed by wealth. The past was filled with small moments, so small that most went unnoticed. But in Walter's mind, they weighed like stones. He had never spoken of it to anyone, but perhaps he had seen in Elliot something he himself lacked, the ability to care without expecting anything in return. Walter had observed the janitor, always present, always willing, even when no one else seemed to notice. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had found in Elliot a reflection of the kindness he had always wanted to embody but never quite managed to express. As the night wore on and the rain continued to beat against the mansion's windows, Elliot Spencer remained in his modest apartment, staring at the pile of papers the lawyer had left behind. He didn't want any of it. He didn't want the weight that came with the money, nor the sudden attention that placed him at the center of a storm he never sought. He had never asked Walter for anything, had never dared to think he was more than an invisible employee. But Walter had seen something in him, something no one else had. Elliot had never expected much from life. From an early age, he learned that big dreams were for those with privilege. He, on the other hand, had to fight just to put food on the table. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, taking care of his younger siblings after their father left and their mother fell ill. School was a luxury he gave up early, trading books for temporary jobs. By the time he secured the janitor position at Walter Alden's mansion, he had endured more setbacks than most people face in a lifetime. The work at the mansion was monotonous, but Elliot never complained. He was grateful for the steady paycheck, the stability that allowed him to care for his wife, Megan, when she was diagnosed with cancer. He often arrived early and stayed late, not because anyone forced him to, but because he knew it was necessary. And Walter, despite his distant and reserved demeanor, seemed to notice. He didn't say much, but sometimes, without explanation, Elliot would find small gestures that showed he wasn't invisible. Elliot recalled one particular day that remained etched in his memory. Megan was in the hospital undergoing treatment, and the medical bills were piling up. He had no idea how he would manage to pay them but was too proud to ask for help. That afternoon, while sweeping the hallway near Walter's office, the millionaire called him in. It was rare for Walter to address him directly, so Elliot entered hesitantly. Walter looked at him, his eyes carrying something Elliot couldn't quite decipher. Without preamble, he handed him an envelope. "This is for you. Use it where it's needed most," Walter said, his tone free of condescension, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When Elliot opened the envelope later, he found enough money to cover Megan's medical expenses for the next few months. That night, Elliot cried for the first time in years, not because of the money, but because someone had noticed. Walter, a man who barely spoke to him, had seen his struggle and extended a hand in a way no one else had. From that day on, Elliot began to see Walter in a new light, not as an employer but as someone who, in his peculiar way, understood the weight of silent battles. Now, staring at the will, Elliot felt a tightness in his chest. He had never asked Walter for anything, yet he had been given everything. The memory of that gesture was what kept him sitting there, resisting the urge to flee. He didn't know if he deserved the inheritance, but deep down, he was starting to understand that for Walter, it wasn't about deserving. It was about something bigger, something only the two of them seemed to grasp. Claire had never been one to dwell on the past. For her, life was about moving forward, even if that meant leaving some stories unfinished. But now, with Walter's will exposed like an open wound, she found herself compelled to seek answers. That morning, as the sky remained overcast from the previous night's storm, Claire climbed the stairs toward her father's study. It was a place she had avoided since childhood. Everything about it felt cold, the neatly arranged shelves, the furniture that seemed designed to deter lingering. With a mixture of hesitation and determination, she began opening drawers, pulling out old documents, contracts, and letters that Walter had kept. It wasn't curiosity driving her, but a need to understand. What was he thinking? The question pounded in her mind. She couldn't believe that her father, so rational and methodical, could simply disregard his own daughter. The weight of resentment made her comb through every paper, as though she might find something to explain the inexplicable. In the third drawer of the desk, Claire found a small leather notebook. It was worn, with frayed edges, as if it had been handled repeatedly over the years. When she opened it, the pages revealed something she never expected: Walter's personal musings, not about business, but about his thoughts and feelings. It wasn't a conventional diary. The entries were brief, isolated phrases, almost like reflections scribbled during sleepless nights. Elliot. Honesty in a world full of self-interest. Claire has strength, but I never managed to tell her. I failed as a father. Martin, he always wanted what was mine, but never saw what truly mattered. The words were simple but cutting. Claire read and reread each line, feeling the weight of emotions Walter had never dared to share. He acknowledged his shortcomings, admitted his flaws, and hinted at a side of himself she had never known. A side that seemed to have found some form of redemption in Elliot. Tucked between the pages, Claire discovered an envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to her. The handwriting was firm but carried the hesitancy of someone more comfortable acting than speaking. Claire. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. I was never good at expressing my feelings, but I want you to know that I've always admired your strength. You don't need my money to be remarkable, you already are. Elliot, on the other hand, is the kind of person the world overlooks but deserves to be seen. My choice isn't against you, it's for something greater. I hope that, one day, you'll understand. With love. Your father. Claire's eyes filled with tears, though she wasn't sure if they stemmed from anger, sadness, or longing. It was as if the letter had been written by a stranger, someone she had never truly known. Walter had always been rigid, reserved, but within these words he could never say aloud, there was a sincerity that disarmed her. Elliot Spencer had never imagined money could feel so heavy. Not the physical weight of bills or the legal papers confirming his inheritance, but the burden of knowing everyone now saw him differently. Since the day Walter's will was read, Elliot had been scrutinized as if he carried something that didn't belong to him. People no longer saw him as the humble janitor of the mansion but as the man who had somehow won what no one else could. That morning, he wandered through the mansion's garden, a place he knew better than any other. The plants, which he had carefully tended, seemed more vibrant than ever after the storm. Yet he no longer felt the peace the garden used to offer. Every corner seemed weighed down by the past, by memories that weren't his but that he had helped preserve. As he walked, his mind drifted to thoughts he had never allowed before. Why did Walter do this? Did he see something in me that I can't see in myself? Or will all of this end up destroying me? The money, which so many saw as a solution to every problem, had become the center of a storm in his life. It wasn't just Claire and Martin judging him, he couldn't stop questioning himself. Suddenly, Claire's presence interrupted his thoughts. She stood at the edge of the garden path. For the first time since the reading of the will, her gaze wasn't filled with anger but something harder to define, doubt, maybe even sadness. Elliot, she began, her voice softer than usual. Do you really think my father made the right choice? Elliot took a deep breath, unsure of how to answer. He looked down at the ground, then at his hands, as though searching for answers somewhere in the air around him. I don't know, Claire. I don't know why he chose this. But what I do know is that I never asked for it. And if I could, I wouldn't have accepted. She took a few steps closer, crossing her arms. Then why don't you refuse it? If you think you don't deserve it, why not give back what he left you? The question hit both of them like a brick. Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the dilemma that had been haunting him. Because this isn't just money. It's not just about me or about you. It's about what he wanted, Claire. And as much as I don't fully understand it, I know he thought long and hard before deciding. Claire remained silent. For the first time, she seemed to truly listen to his words. There were no easy answers in that conversation, not for her, not for Elliot. They were grappling with the fragments of a man who, in life, had never been able to explain himself but who, in his absence, had left a trail of questions no one knew how to answer. The night was silent, but inside the mansion, emotions were anything but calm. Claire and Martin had decided to confront Elliot once more. To them, it wasn't just about the money, or at least that's what they told themselves. It was about answers, about understanding how a man who had lived in Walter Alden's shadow could have been chosen as the heir to everything the family believed was rightfully theirs. Elliot stood in the grand hall, near one of the massive windows, staring outside. The reflection in the glass revealed his weary expression, as if the weight of the past weeks had drained all his energy. He knew the confrontation was inevitable. When he heard Claire and Martin's approaching footsteps, he drew in a deep breath. "Elliot," Martin began, his voice laced with bitterness, "I need to understand. What did you do to earn my brother's trust? What did he see in you that he never saw in us?" Elliot turned slowly to face them. For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Then, in a low but steady voice, he replied, "I didn't do anything, Martin. At least, nothing you can measure." Claire, who had remained quiet until then, stepped forward. "Nothing? Are you telling me my father left everything to you, for nothing? Don't act like you didn't know something. This doesn't make sense." Elliot struggled to remain calm, but Claire's tone struck him like invisible blows. He knew she was hurt, but he couldn't allow himself to become the target of all her anger. "I never asked for this money, Claire. And you know as well as I do that your father didn't make impulsive decisions. Maybe, he was trying to fix something he couldn't while he was alive." Martin let out a bitter laugh. "Fix? Walter? He was never the type to admit mistakes, let alone try to fix them. Walter was a businessman, Elliot. To him, everything was a transaction, a matter of who deserved what. So tell me, why did you deserve it?" Elliot took a deep breath, feeling the lump in his throat tighten. "Maybe because I never expected anything from him. While everyone else was busy figuring out what they could take from him, I was just doing my job." The room fell into a heavy silence. Claire and Martin didn't know how to respond. Elliot's words echoed in their minds, forcing them to confront their own insecurities and mistakes. Maybe Walter had seen something they hadn't. Perhaps, in Elliot's simplicity, there was a truth they had lost amidst their own expectations and grudges. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice softer this time. "I don't want to hate you, Elliot. But it's hard to understand. He was my father. And all I ever wanted was for him to see me." Elliot took a small step closer, his eyes meeting hers. "I think he did see you, Claire. He just didn't know how to say it. Sometimes, people let their actions speak for them. Maybe that's what he did with me. And maybe that's what he tried to do with you too, in his own way." Elliot's words didn't erase the pain, but they left a mark. Claire and Martin began to realize that the inheritance wasn't just about money. It was a reflection of who Walter was, or who he wanted to be. Elliot Spencer had finally made his decision. He had spent sleepless nights revisiting every memory, every interaction he had with Walter Alden. Claire's words echoed in his mind, "Why don't you just refuse it?" But it wasn't that simple. Rejecting the inheritance felt like an affront to Walter's memory, as though he was rejecting something far greater than money. Accepting it, however, meant carrying a weight he had never asked for. That morning, Elliot walked slowly through the mansion's garden, the place where Walter had spent the few moments of rest he allowed himself. The garden seemed to carry the man's spirit, meticulous, serene, yet deeply rooted. Elliot ran his fingers along the trunk of one of the trees, remembering the day they had planted that row of oaks together. Walter hadn't said much, only mentioning that trees like those could last for generations. Perhaps it had been a metaphor he never had the courage to explain. Claire appeared in the garden not long after. Her steps were hesitant, but there was something different about her demeanor. Elliot noticed that the hostility that had dominated their previous conversations was gone. She stopped beside him, looking at the same row of trees. "My father loved this place," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Yeah. He used to say it was the only place he could think clearly," Elliot replied. For a while, neither of them said anything more. The silence felt more comfortable than any words could have been. Finally, Claire took a deep breath and asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Have you decided what you're going to do with the inheritance?" Elliot shook his head thoughtfully. "I'm not sure yet. But I know what I don't want. I don't want this money to turn me into someone I'm not. And I don't want it to cause any more pain for anyone." Claire turned to face him, her eyes fixed on his. "You're not to blame for this, Elliot. I think, for the first time, I'm starting to understand what my father saw in you. He wasn't choosing between us. He was choosing something he thought needed to be done." Elliot looked at her, surprised by the gentleness in her words. "Do you think he was trying to teach me something, or teach something to you?" Claire gave a small, almost sad smile. "Maybe both." They spent the rest of the time walking through the garden, speaking little but feeling something different, a sense of understanding. Elliot knew that moment was just the beginning of something bigger, a path he would have to navigate carefully. He didn't yet know exactly how to use Walter's fortune, but he was determined to make it mean something more than just numbers in a bank account. Something Walter would have been proud to see. A few weeks later, the sun finally shone over the Alden mansion. The weight of recent decisions still lingered in the air, but there was a different kind of calm now, the kind that only comes after a storm. Elliot Spencer, a man who had spent most of his life in the background, now found himself at the center of a transformation he had never anticipated. He sat in Walter's study, behind the large, dark wooden desk where so many decisions had been made. Before him was a pile of documents and letters, records of anonymous donations Walter had made over the years. Money sent to hospitals, orphanages, and small causes no one ever knew he supported. What Claire and Martin had perceived as coldness was, in reality, the quiet kindness of a man who helped without seeking recognition. Elliot gazed at the letters, a tightness in his chest. He realized what Walter had truly left him, not just money, but the opportunity to continue something Walter had never been able to express fully. It wasn't about amassing wealth, it was about making it mean something to others. Claire entered the study, observing him in silence for a moment before speaking. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Elliot looked up at her, a faint smile crossing his face. "I didn't know I was looking for anything, but I think I found it." She walked closer to the desk, picking up one of the letters. Her eyes scanned the words quickly before settling on Elliot. "Did he do this all on his own?" "Seems like he did," Elliot replied. "No fanfare, no credit. He just did it." She sighed and took a seat in the chair next to him, finally starting to understand what her father had been trying to teach them all along. He really saw things none of us ever noticed. "Yes," Elliot said softly. And somehow, he knew there was still time for things to change. For a while, they sat in silence. But it wasn't the heavy silence of the early days, it was a silence of acceptance. Each carried their own pain, but at the same time, they began to see that Walter's legacy wasn't something to divide or fight over. It was something to share. In the days that followed, Elliot decided that part of the fortune would go toward continuing Walter's quiet work, donations to people who needed it far more than they did. He carried it out discreetly, just as Walter would have, expecting nothing in return. Martin, who had spent so much of his life envying his brother, also began to see things differently. He grew closer to Claire and Elliot, and together, they began discussing how they could ensure the Alden fortune was used to create a meaningful impact. The money, which had once felt like a burden, now became a tool for something greater. And you, what do you think defines who deserves a legacy as grand as Walter's? Should wealth go to those in need or to those closest to us? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for another emotional story.